Hello, I'm Stephen Leake, and I am an elder and Sunday school teacher of the Discipleship Sunday School class at First Presbyterian Church in Mesquite. And we're continuing our study of the Gospel of John on the introduction, and this is the third part of the introduction lesson. In the second part of the introduction to John, we learned that there were two special features or issues which had emerged in the situation of the young Christian church. The first, which we studied last week in lesson 2, was that the church was now predominantly Gentile. The second of the great issues confronting the church when the fourth gospel was written was the rise of heresy. It was now about 70 years since Jesus had been crucified. By this time, the church was an organization and an institution. Theologies and creeds were being thought out and stated, and inevitably the thoughts of some people went down mistaken ways, and heresies resulted. A heresy is seldom a complete untruth. It usually results when one facet of the truth is unduly emphasized. And today we're going to use as examples two of the heresies which the writer of the fourth gospel, John, sought to combat. First, there were certain Christians, especially Jewish Christians, who gave too high a place to John the Baptist. There was something about him which had an inevitable appeal to the Jews. He walked in the prophetic succession and talked with a prophetic voice. We know that in later times there was an accepted sect of John the Baptist within the Orthodox Jewish faith. In Acts 19, 1 through 7, we come upon a little group of 12 on the fringe of the Christian church who had never gotten beyond the baptism of John. Over and over again, the fourth gospel quietly but definitely relegates John to his proper place. Over and over again, John the Baptist denies that he has ever claimed or possessed the highest place, and without qualification yields that place to Jesus. We've already seen that in the other Gospels, the ministry of Jesus did not begin until John the Baptist had been put in prison. But in the fourth Gospel, their ministries overlap. The writer of the fourth Gospel may well have used that arrangement to show John and Jesus in actual meeting, and to show that John used these meetings to admit and urge others to admit the supremacy of Jesus. It's carefully pointed out that John is not the light. He is shown as quite definitely disclaiming all messianic aspirations. It's not even permissible to think of him as the highest witness. Now, there's no criticism at all of John the Baptist in the fourth gospel, but there's a rebuke to those who would give him a place which ought to belong to Jesus and Jesus alone. Now, I have spoken at a lot of churches, and in many churches there's a little plaque in the place where you preach from. I forget what that's called. And that little plaque says, "He must increase and I must decrease." And this is something that John the Baptist is quoting as saying to his disciples in the 3rd chapter of the Gospel of John. So John the Baptist definitely realized that, and John, the Gospel writer, remembered that in his Gospel. Second, a certain type of heresy which was very widely spread in the days when the fourth Gospel was written is called by the general name of Gnosticism. And without some understanding of it, much of John's greatness and much of his aim will be missed. The basic doctrine of Gnosticism was that matter is essentially evil and and spirit is essentially good. The Gnostics went on to argue that on that basis, God himself cannot touch matter and therefore did not create the world. What he did was to put out a series of emanations. Each of these emanations was further from him until at last there was one so distant from him that it could touch matter. And that emanation was the creator of the world. By itself, that idea is bad enough, but it was made worse by an addition. The Gnostics held that each emanation knew less and less about God until there was a stage when the emanations were not only ignorant of God, but actually hostile to him. So they finally came to the conclusion that the Creator God was not only different from the real God, but was also quite ignorant of and actively hostile to him. Cerinthus, one of the leaders of the Gnostics, said that the world was created not by God, but by a certain power far separate from him and far distant from that power who is over the universe, and ignorant of the God who is over all. So the Gnostics believed that God had nothing to do with the creating of the world. That's why John begins his gospel with the ringing statement, all things came into being through him, and without him not one thing came into being. And that's why John insists that God so loved the world that he gave his only son. In that famous verse, John 3:16. In the face of the Gnostics, who so mistakenly spiritualized God into a being who could not possibly have anything to do with the world, John presented the Christian doctrine of God who made the world and whose presence fills the world that he has made. The beliefs of the Gnostics also impinged on their ideas of Jesus. Some of the Gnostics held that Jesus was one of the emanations which had proceeded from God. They held that he was not in any real sense divine. To them, he was only a kind of a demigod who was more or less distant from the real God, that he was simply one of a chain of lesser beings between God and the world. And some Gnostics held that Jesus had no real body. A body is matter and God could not touch matter. Therefore, Jesus was a kind of phantom without real flesh and blood. They never could have said, the Word became flesh, in that beautiful verse, John 1:14. St. Augustine tells how he had read much in the work of the philosophers of his day. He had found much that was very like what was in the New Testament. But he said, the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us. I did not read there. That's why John in his first letter insists that Jesus came in the flesh and declares that anyone who denies that fact is moved by the spirit of the Antichrist. Now, this particular heresy is known as Docetism. Docetism comes from the Greek word dokein, which means to seem. And the heresy is so called because it held that Jesus only seemed to be a man. Some Gnostics held a variation of that heresy. They held that Jesus was a man into whom the Spirit of God came in his baptism, and that the Spirit remained with him throughout his life until the end. But since the Spirit of God could never suffer and die, it left him before he was crucified. They give Jesus' cry on the cross as, my power, why hast thou forsaken me? And in their books, they told of people talking on the Mount of Olives to a form which looked exactly like Jesus, while the man Jesus died on the cross. So then the Gnostic heresies were expressed in two possible alternative beliefs. They believed either that Jesus was not really divine, but simply one of a series of emanations from God, or a kind of phantom in the shape of a man. The Gnostic beliefs at one and the same time destroyed the real Godhead and the real humanity of Jesus. The fact that God is out to correct the fact that John is out to correct both of these Gnostic tendencies explains a curious, paradoxical double emphasis in his gospel. On the one hand, there's no gospel which so uncompromisingly stresses the real humanity of Jesus. Jesus was angry with those who bought and sold in the temple courts, and he was physically tired as he sat by the well, which was near Sychar in Samaria. His disciples offered him food in the way they would offer it to any hungry man. He had sympathy with those who were hungry and with those who were afraid. He knew grief, and he wept tears as any mourner might do. In the agony of the cross, the cry of his parched lips was, "I am thirsty." The fourth gospel shows us a Jesus who was no shadowy, docetic figure. It shows us one who knew the weariness of an exhausted body and the wounds of a distressed mind and heart. It's the truly human Jesus whom the fourth gospel sets before us. On the other hand, there's no gospel which sets before us such a view of the deity of Jesus. John stresses the pre-existence of Jesus. Before Abraham was, said Jesus, I am. He talks of the glory which he had with the Father before the world was made. Again and again he speaks of his coming down from heaven. John saw in Jesus one who had always been, even before the world began. The fourth gospel stresses more than any of the others the omniscience of Jesus. It's John's view that Jesus knew the past record of the woman of Samaria. And without anyone telling him, he knew how long the man beside the healing pool had been ill. Before he asked it, he knew the answer to the question he put to Philip. He knew that Judas would betray him. And he knew of the death of Lazarus before anyone told him. John saw in Jesus one who had a special and miraculous knowledge, independent of anything he might be told. He needed to ask no questions because he knew the answers. The fourth gospel stresses the fact, as John saw it, that Jesus always acted entirely on his own initiative and was not influenced by anyone else. It was not his mother's request which moved him to the miracle at Cana in Galilee. It was his own personal decision. The urging of his brothers had nothing to do with him in the visit which he paid to Jerusalem at the Feast of the Tabernacles. No one took his life from him. No one could. He laid it down purely voluntarily. Jesus had a divine independence from all human influence. He was self-determined. To counter the Gnostics and their strange beliefs, John presents us with a Jesus who was undeniably human and undeniably divine. And next week we'll continue with the introduction to John by talking about the author of the Gospel of John. Thank you. God bless.